The courthouse steps felt colder than November had any right to be. Claire Meadows stood motionless as rain hammered the concrete around her. The bankruptcy folder clutched against her chest, doing nothing to shield her from the downpour or the reality it represented. 38 years old. 15 years as a financial analyst. All of it reduced to this moment, where she had exactly $67 in her checking account, and 3 days before her landlord changed the locks. Her daughter Mia shifted beside hTer, 10 years old and trying so hard to be brave. The child's hand tightened in Claire's, small fingers cold despite the gloves Claire had insisted she wore, even though Claire's own hands were bare and numb. Behind them, the Philadelphia skyline rose in gray indifference. The city that had once represented opportunity, now feeling like a wall designed specifically to keep her out. "Mom." Mia's voice cut through the sound of rain on concrete. "Can we go inside somewhere? I'm cold." The question landed with the weight of every failure Claire had tried to shield her daughter from. For weeks ago, she'd been senior analyst at Whitmore Financial Group, managing a portfolio of institutional clients. For weeks ago, before she'd refused to sign off on fraudulent compliance reports for the Henderson Real Estate Fund. For weeks ago, before she'd been escorted from the building by security, her reputation destroyed by carefully planted rumors about mental instability and substance abuse. Claire's phone vibrated in her coat pocket. Another creditor, probably. She'd stopped answering days ago, letting them chase the ghost of who she used to be. Someone with a 401k and health insurance and a future that extended beyond next Tuesday. But the vibration persisted, insistent, and something made her pull it out despite the rain, threatening to short out the screen. Unknown number. Not a creditor, then. Probably spam. Her finger hovered over decline before a flicker of desperate hope. Maybe a response to one of the 73 job applications she'd sent. Made her answer. The voice that emerged carried the weight of years, formal but gentle. "Miss Meadows? This is Arthur Pemberton. I'm handling your father's estate matters." Claire almost laughed at the absurdity. Robert Meadows had been dead for 18 months, leaving behind nothing but a modest pension that had barely covered his funeral expenses and the small assisted living debt he'd accumulated in his final year. The estate had been settled. Closed. Whatever Pemberton wanted, it couldn't possibly matter now. "My father's estate was finalized last year," she said, rain streaming down her face. "There's nothing left to handle. Actually, Miss Meadows, there are some items your father specifically requested be delivered to you personally. I've tried reaching you at your previous address, but I was evicted 2 weeks ago." The words came out flat, stripped of shame through sheer repetition. "I'm currently staying in an extended stay motel with my daughter." The pause on the other end suggested Pemberton was recalculating his approach. "I see. Well, there are some personal effects your father wanted you to have. Nothing of significant monetary value, I'm afraid, but items of sentimental importance. An old radio, some photographs, personal papers. I could deliver them to wherever is convenient." Claire looked down at Mia, whose hope-filled eyes were watching her mother's face for clues about whether this phone call might mean something good. An old radio. Her father's ancient Zenith console that had sat in his living room for as long as Claire could remember, playing big band music and crackling news broadcasts even after everyone else had moved on to digital everything. The radio? Claire's throat tightened unexpectedly. "He left me his radio?" "Among other things, yes. He was quite specific in his instructions. The radio was to go to you personally, along with a sealed letter. I could bring everything by tomorrow if that works." They arranged a meeting at the motel for 10 a.m. After Pemberton hung up, Claire stood on the courthouse steps, trying to remember the last time she'd actually looked at her father's radio. Really looked at it, not just walked past it during obligatory holiday visits. The Zenith had been a fixture of her childhood, massive and wooden, with cloth speaker grills and dial faces that glowed amber when powered on. Her father had treated it like a religious artifact, dusting it weekly, replacing tubes with the care of a surgeon, refusing to even consider replacing it with something modern. Mia tugged at her sleeve. "Was that about Grandpa Robert?" "Yes, baby. He left us some things. We're going to get them tomorrow." "Like what things?" Claire crouched down, a level with her daughter, searching for words that wouldn't be lies. An old radio. Some pictures. Things that reminded him of when I was growing up. Is the radio valuable? Like on those shows where people find treasures in their attics. The question hit harder than it should have. Claire forced a smile she didn't feel. No, sweetheart. It's just old. But it meant something to Grandpa, so it means something to us. They caught the bus back to the motel, a place that charged by the week and didn't ask questions about people clearly living there despite no extended stay signs on the walls. The room smelled like decades of cigarette smoke imperfectly masked by industrial cleaning products. 2 beds, a bathroom with questionable plumbing, and a kitchenette consisting of a microwave and mini fridge. Home, at least for the next 6 days, until Claire's remaining money ran out. Mia did homework at the small table, while Claire tried to make dinner stretch from the groceries she'd carefully rationed. Ramen with frozen vegetables, marginally nutritious, definitely cheap. As water boiled on the hot plate she'd bought at Goodwill, Claire's mind kept circling back to the radio. Her father had been a radio engineer before retirement, spending 40 years at RCA and then various smaller firms, maintaining and repairing equipment that most people had forgotten existed. He'd loved that zenith with an intensity Claire had never understood, often spending evenings just listening to it, hands folded in his lap, eyes closed like he was meditating. After Claire's mother had died, 12 years ago now, the radio had seemed to become even more important to him, a connection to something he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. That night, lying in the dark listening to Mia's steady breathing from the other bed, Claire let herself remember the last real conversation she'd had with her father, 3 months before he died, during what would be her final visit to the assisted living facility. He'd been lucid that day, more present than he'd been in weeks, and he'd gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Claire Bear," he'd said, using the nickname from her childhood. "Promise me something. Anything, Dad. When I'm gone, don't let Richard and Margaret talk you into throwing away the radio. They'll want you to. They'll say it's junk, that it's taking up space, that no one uses tube radios anymore. Don't listen to them." Claire had promised, confused by the urgency in his voice. Her siblings had always been dismissive of their father's hobbies, viewing his attachment to old technology as embarrassing eccentricity. But she'd assured him the radio would be safe. Then he'd said something that hadn't made sense at the time, still didn't make sense now. The radio knows things. When you really need it, when you're desperate enough to actually listen, you'll understand. Not before. Has to be when you're ready. She thought it was the dementia talking, his mind wandering through metaphors that meant something to him, but nothing to anyone else. Now, lying in a motel room with $67 to her name and no plan beyond surviving until Friday, Claire wondered if desperate enough had finally arrived. Morning came with weak November sunlight that did nothing to improve the motel's aesthetic. Claire got Mia ready for school. A new school, the 3rd one this semester, where the teachers had been briefed on their temporary housing situation with varying degrees of sympathy and judgment. The bus pickup was 2 blocks away, early enough that Claire walked Mia there herself despite the cold, unwilling to let her daughter navigate even that short distance alone. "Will the radio be there when I get home?" Mia asked as they waited at the corner. "Should be. Mr. Pemberton is bringing it this morning. Can we listen to it? To the same music Grandpa Robert liked." Claire's throat tightened. "We'll try, baby. I don't know if it still works." The bus arrived, yellow and loud and normal in ways that felt precious. Mia climbed aboard with her backpack, new from the Salvation Army, indistinguishable from expensive versions, and waved from a window seat. Claire waved back until the bus disappeared, then walked slowly back to the motel, dreading and anticipating the delivery in equal measure. Arthur Pemberton arrived exactly at 10 a.m., driving a modest sedan that suggested he wasn't one of Philadelphia's white shoe attorneys. Late 60s, gray hair carefully combed, wearing a suit that had been expensive once but showed its age in ways that made Claire like him more. He struggled with the radio, its bulk awkward despite the hand-carved handles on each side. "Your father's instructions were very specific," Pemberton said as they maneuvered the Zenith through the motel room door. The radio was to be delivered intact, not sold or donated regardless of your financial circumstances. He established a small fund to ensure delivery, even if tracking you down took time. They set it on the dresser, the only surface large enough to accommodate its bulk. Up close, the radio looked even more impressive than Claire remembered. The cabinet was genuine walnut, hand-finished with a patina that suggested decades of careful maintenance. The dial face showed zenith long distance and station markers for cities that might not exist anymore. The whole thing probably weighed 60 pounds, solid and substantial in ways modern electronics never achieved. Pemberton handed her a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, her name written in her father's distinctive engineer's print. He gave this to me 3 years ago, with instructions to deliver it only after his passing and only directly to you. After Pemberton left, Claire sat on the bed, staring at the envelope for 20 minutes before opening it. Her father's handwriting filled 3 pages, the precision of his lettering suggesting he'd taken his time, chosen each word carefully. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're in trouble. Real trouble, the kind that makes you question everything. I know this because I arranged things so you wouldn't get the radio until circumstances forced you to actually need it. Not want it for sentiment, but need it for survival. Your mother and I bought this radio in 1952, the year we got married. Cost $189, which was nearly a month's salary back then. Everyone said we were crazy spending that much on a radio. But it was beautiful, and it represented something, the future, technology, possibility. What no one knew, what I never told anyone including your mother, was why I really bought this specific radio. I worked at the Zenith plant in Philadelphia from 1951 to 1953 before I went to RCA. During that time, I was part of a team doing experimental work on radio equipment. Some of it legitimate, some of it not. We were approached by certain individuals who wanted us to build very specific hiding places into select units. Places that would go undetected for decades. This particular radio, serial number Z7243R, was one of mine. I built it myself on my own time, using the techniques they taught us. And I've been maintaining its secret for 70 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person. Your siblings don't know and can't know. Richard would sell it immediately without thinking. Margaret would donate it for a tax write-off. Neither of them has ever needed anything badly enough to look beyond surface value. But you, Claire, you're different. You have your mother's integrity, her inability to compromise on what matters. That quality will cost you everything, then save you. The hiding place is in the base, not the battery compartment, not the tube chassis, the actual base. You'll need to remove 6 screws from the bottom panel. They look like regular wood screws, but they're made of brass, softer than steel. Don't strip them. Once the panel is off, you'll see a false bottom. Pry it up carefully. What's underneath is legally yours. Acquired through legitimate means I'll explain in the documents you'll find. I prepared for this moment for decades. Maintained everything, kept records, ensured clear chain of custody. The value is significant enough to change your life, your daughter's life. But more important than the money is what it represents. Proof that honest work, careful planning, and faith in future possibility can transcend immediate circumstance. Use it wisely. Don't tell anyone until you've secured proper legal counsel. Trust is earned, not given freely, especially when money enters the equation. Your siblings will claim they deserve shares. They don't. This is yours alone, intended for the child who needed it rather than the children who would waste it. I love you, Claire Bear. I'm proud of the woman you've become, even though I won't be there to see how this changes your life. Your mother will be proud, too. Oh, my love, Dad. Claire read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking worse with each pass. Her father had hidden something valuable in the radio's base, something significant enough to warrant this elaborate preservation plan, important enough that he'd worried about her siblings claiming it. She looked at the Zenith sitting on the dresser, its wooden case giving no hints about what might be concealed within. The rational part of her brain, the financial analyst who'd spent 15 years evaluating assets and liabilities, insisted this was probably a wild goose chase. Her father had been old, possibly confused, building elaborate fantasies around a piece of furniture. But another part, the part that remembered his precision, his methodical nature, his inability to exaggerate or fabricate, insisted she at least look. What did she have to lose? She was already at rock bottom. Opening the radio wouldn't make things worse. Claire pulled the dresser away from the wall, creating space to maneuver. The radio was heavier than it looked, solid wood and tube electronics, combining in a mass that belonged to an era when products were built to last generations. She tipped it carefully onto its side, examining the bottom panel. 6 screws, exactly as her father had described. Brass, not steel, their heads slightly worn but intact. Claire retrieved the small screwdriver set she'd grabbed during the eviction, one of the few tools she'd thought to save. The screws turned smoothly, suggesting regular maintenance. Her father had prepared this moment with the same care he'd applied to everything. The bottom panel came away to reveal the radio's undercarriage. Tube sockets, wiring, transformers, the guts of 1952 technology laid bare. And beneath it all, a wooden platform that looked like structural support but seemed too thick, too deliberate. Claire's fingers found the edge, felt for purchase. The false bottom resisted briefly, then lifted with a whisper of old wood separating from older wood. Underneath, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth, sat something that made her breath catch. Bonds. Government bonds, dozens of them, arranged in careful stacks and bound with rubber bands that had long since degraded into sticky residue. Claire lifted the first stack with trembling hands, wiping away decades of dust to read the denomination printed across the top. $10,000. United States Savings Bond. Series E. Issue date, March 1952. She counted slowly, methodically, her analyst brain kicking in despite the surreal nature of what she was discovering. 15 bonds in the first stack. More underneath. And underneath those, a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be certificates, official-looking documents with seals and signatures. Claire stopped counting when she reached 120 bonds, her mind struggling with mathematics that seemed impossible. 120 bonds. Face value $10,000 each. Issue date 1952. If they'd been accruing interest for 70-plus years. Her phone was in her hand before she consciously decided to use it, searching for information about Series E savings bonds, their maturity schedules, compound interest calculations. The numbers that emerged made her vision swim. Series E bonds had an original maturity of 30 years, but continued earning interest for 40 years total. These bonds had been issued in 1952, which meant they'd stopped earning interest in 1992. Their final value would be approximately twice the face value, accounting for the guaranteed interest rate of roughly 2.5% annually. 120 bonds at $10,000 face value each meant $1.2 million in principal. After 40 years of interest compounding, the total value would be approximately $2.4 million. $2.4 million. Sitting in the base of her father's radio, in a motel room where she'd been wondering how to afford next week's rent. Claire set the bonds down carefully, her hands shaking too badly to hold them safely. She backed away from the radio, sat on the bed, and tried to breathe through the panic/hope/disbelief flooding her system. This couldn't be real. People didn't find millions of dollars hidden in old furniture. This happened in movies, in inheritance fantasy stories people told themselves when bill collectors called. Not the financial analysts who knew exactly how rare genuine windfalls were. But the bonds looked authentic. The paper felt right, had the weight and texture of government documents from that era. The serial numbers were sequential, suggesting they'd been purchased together, probably through payroll deductions during the war or shortly after. The signatures and seals appeared genuine, though Claire knew she'd need expert verification. She pulled the leather portfolio from the radio's base, opened it with hands that wouldn't stay steady. Inside were documents that made her father's letter suddenly make much more sense. A bill of sale dated March 15, 1952, for $120,000 in Series E bonds, purchased by Robert James Meadows. A certified letter from the U.S. Treasury Department confirming the purchase and providing registration numbers. Correspondence between her father and various financial institutions regarding proper storage and maintenance of the bonds. And most critically, a notarized letter dated 1985 explaining the bond's origins. Claire read this document with the focus she'd once applied to compliance reports, understanding its importance even as its contents seemed increasingly unlikely. To whom it may concern, I, Robert James Meadows, hereby attest to the following regarding United States Savings Bond serial numbers E847392 through E847511. In March 1952, I was employed at the Zenith Radio Corporation plant in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, working as a junior engineer in the R&D division. During this period, I participated in legitimate defense contract work developing radio equipment for military applications. On March 8, 1952, I received a bonus payment of $125,000 for my contribution to Project Longwave, a classified research initiative whose details remain protected under federal secrecy statutes. This payment was legal, properly taxed, and documented through official Zenith and Department of Defense channels. I used $120,000 of this bonus to purchase Series E savings bonds through the Fidelity Trust Bank of Philadelphia on March 15, 1952. The bonds were registered in my name and stored in a secure location known only to myself. These bonds represent legitimate earnings from legitimate work. All applicable taxes were paid. All documentation has been preserved. Should questions arise regarding their origin or legality, complete records exist in safety deposit box number 247 at First National Bank of Philadelphia, key held by my estate attorney Arthur Pemberton. I affirm under penalty of perjury that the above statements are true and accurate. Signed, Robert James Meadows, notarized September 12, 1985. Claire set down the document, her mind racing through implications. Her father had earned $125,000 in 1952, equivalent to roughly $1.5 million in current dollars, for defense contract work. He'd converted most of it to bonds, then hidden them in a radio he'd built himself, maintaining the secret for 70 years. The bonds had been real, legal, properly acquired, which meant their current value, whatever it turned out to be, was legitimately hers. A knock at the door jolted Claire back to the present. She shoved the bonds and documents back into the radio base, replacing the false bottom and bottom panel with fumbling haste, turning the screws just far enough to hold everything in place. "Who is it?" Her voice came out higher than normal, strained by adrenaline. "Claire? It's Margaret. Let me in. It's freezing out here." Claire's sister. The last person she wanted to see right now. The letter had warned her specifically about Margaret and Richard, told her not to tell them anything. But refusing to let her sister in would only create suspicion. She opened the door to find Margaret Connolly looking exactly like she always did. Expensive coat, designer handbag, the kind of put-together appearance that came from having money and time to maintain it. Her expression cycled from concern to disapproval as she took in the motel room, the circumstances her younger sister had fallen into. "My God, Claire, this is where you're living?" Temporarily. Claire didn't move to let Margaret fully inside, maintaining position in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" "Richard told me about your situation. We've been worried. I wanted to check on you and Mia, make sure you're okay." The concern would have been more convincing if Margaret had bothered to return Claire's calls over the past month, if she'd offered help before circumstances became public spectacle. But Claire forced a smile, knowing antagonizing her sister served no purpose. "We're managing. It's not permanent, just until I get back on my feet." Margaret's gaze swept the room and landed on the radio, sitting on the dresser. Her expression shifted, recognition and disdain mixing. "Jesus Christ, that's Dad's old Zenith. Why on earth do you have that here? That thing weighs a ton and takes up half the room. Dad left it to me specifically. His attorney delivered it this morning." "Claire, that's ridiculous. It's a 60-pound piece of junk from the 50s. You're living in a motel room with a 10-year-old, and you're keeping a broken radio that probably doesn't even work." Margaret moved toward it, one hand reaching out to touch the wooden case. Richard and I can take it, donate it somewhere. Clear up some space for you. Claire stepped between her sister and the radio, the movement instinctive, protective. No, Dad wanted me to have it. Dad was 93 and half senile. He probably couldn't remember what year it was, let alone make rational decisions about furniture distribution. Margaret's tone shifted, taking on the condescending patience she used when explaining obvious things to slower minds. Look, I know you're emotional right now, everything falling apart, but holding on to this giant paperweight isn't going to solve anything. Let me take it. I promise I'll find somewhere that appreciates vintage electronics. I said no, Margaret. The firmness in Claire's voice seemed to surprise her sister. Margaret stepped back, recalculating her approach. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something meant to sound reasonable, but came across as manipulation dressed in concern. Claire, I'm trying to help. Richard and I have both been worried about you living like this, raising Mia in this, she gestured around the room, environment. If you're making irrational decisions, keeping worthless furniture instead of accepting practical help, maybe we need to have a larger conversation about what's best for everyone. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Claire felt her pulse accelerate, understanding what Margaret wasn't quite saying directly. Questions about fitness to parent, about mental stability, about whether someone who'd been fired for erratic behavior should be solely responsible for a 10-year-old's welfare. You should leave. Claire moved to the door, opening it with deliberate calm. Thank you for your concern, but Mia and I are fine. The radio stays with me. Margaret's expression hardened. This isn't over, Claire. Richard and I are not going to stand by and watch you self-destruct while dragging your daughter down with you. We're family. Sometimes family has to make hard choices for each other's good. After Margaret left, Claire locked the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering. The radio sat on the dresser exactly where she'd left it, innocent and ordinary to anyone who didn't know what it contained. But Margaret knew about it now, had seen it, would tell Richard. The letter's warnings echoed in Claire's mind. Don't tell anyone until you've secured proper legal counsel. Your siblings will claim they deserve shares. She needed help. Professional help from someone who understood financial instruments, estate law, securities authentication. Someone who wouldn't judge her circumstances or question her competence. Someone she could trust. Her phone had one name in the contacts list that might qualify. Jennifer Park, a former colleague from Whitmore Financial who'd left the company 3 years ago to start her own wealth management practice. They'd stayed in touch sporadically, lunch a few times a year, holiday cards with genuine warmth. Jennifer had been one of the few people at Whitmore who'd believed Claire's account of what had happened with the Henderson Fund. The call went to voicemail. Claire left a message that tried to sound casual despite everything riding on it. Jen, it's Claire Meadows. I know this is out of the blue, but I need some advice on a financial matter. It's complicated and somewhat time-sensitive. Call me when you can. The next 4 hours passed in agonizing slowness. Claire retrieved Mia from school, made dinner from the last of their groceries, helped with homework while trying to act normal despite the fortune hidden 5 feet away in her father's radio. Every creak in the hallway made her jump, convinced it was Margaret returning with Richard, with lawyers, with Child Protective Services. Mia noticed her distraction. Mom, are you okay? You keep staring at Grandpa's radio. Just thinking about him. Missing him. Not a lie exactly. She did miss him, wished desperately she could call him, ask him what to do next. Can we listen to it? You said we'd try. Claire hesitated, then nodded. The radio was probably broken after decades of storage. But if it still worked, maybe hearing her father's music would provide clarity or at least comfort. She plugged it in, half expecting nothing. The radio was old enough that modern electrical systems might not be compatible. But after a few seconds, the tubes began warming, their amber glow visible through ventilation slots in the case. Static hissed from the speakers, then gradually resolved into something resembling actual audio. Claire turned the dial slowly, searching for stations. Most frequencies carried nothing, just dead air where AM radio had once thrived. But then, impossibly, she found music, big band era, the kind of orchestral sound her father had loved. Glenn Miller, maybe, or Tommy Dorsey. The audio quality was surprisingly good, warm in ways that digital reproduction never quite achieved. Mia's eyes widened. It works. Grandpa's radio really works. They sat together listening to music from another era, and for just a moment, the motel room felt less oppressive, less like failure. The radio filled the space with sound that carried weight and presence, each note seeming to have physical mass. Claire's phone rang at 8:47 p.m., Jennifer Park's name on the caller ID. She took it in the bathroom with the door closed, water running to mask the conversation for Mia. "Claire, your message sounded urgent. What's going on?" Everything spilled out in a rush. The bankruptcy, the eviction, her father's death, the radio, the bonds hidden in the base, Margaret's visit. Jennifer listened without interrupting, professional enough to reserve judgment until she had complete information. When Claire finally stopped talking, silence stretched for several seconds before Jennifer responded. "You're telling me you found 120 Series E bond from 1952, face value $10,000 each, hidden in a vintage radio?" "I know how it sounds. Claire, I'm not doubting you. But this is huge. If those bonds are authentic and redeemable, we're talking about millions of dollars. Maybe tens of millions, depending on how interest calculated over 70 years. I calculated about $2.4 million based on standard Series E maturity schedules." Jennifer made a sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp. "Your calculation is conservative. Series E bonds continued accruing interest for 40 years at compound rates. Redemption after that long could be significantly higher per bond. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First priority is authentication and legal verification. Can you help with that? I don't know who else to trust." "Absolutely. But Claire, this needs to be handled very carefully. Bonds of this age and value require specific authentication processes. We'll need experts, documentation, legal counsel to ensure everything is done properly. And given your sister's visit, we need to establish clear ownership before word gets out." They arranged to meet the next day at Jennifer's office. Claire would bring the bonds, the documentation, everything her father had left. Jennifer would contact specialists, bond authenticators, estate attorneys, tax consultants, to begin the verification process. After hanging up, Claire returned to find Mia asleep on her bed, the radio still playing softly. She turned down the volume, but left it on, the music providing soundtrack to her racing thoughts. $2.4 million. Maybe more. Enough to change everything. Secure housing, Mia's education, financial stability for the first time in months. But the letter had warned her. Trust is earned, not given freely, especially when money enters the equation. Claire looked at the radio, its amber glow warm in the darkened room. Her father had protected this secret for 70 years, trusting that when the right moment came, when she was desperate enough, she would find it and understand its significance. She understood. God help her, she understood completely. The next move would determine everything. Jennifer Park's office occupied the 8th floor of a converted warehouse in Northern Liberties, far from the glass towers of Center City, where Whitmore Financial maintained its polished facade. The space felt deliberately unpretentious. Exposed brick, reclaimed wood furniture, windows overlooking the Delaware River. A practice built on competence rather than intimidation. Claire arrived 30 minutes early, having left Mia at school with promises to pick her up on time, the radio wrapped in blankets and secured in a borrowed shopping cart from the motel. Getting it down 3 flights of stairs had required determination bordering on obsession, her arms shaking by the time she reached the lobby. A cab driver had helped load it into his trunk, eyeing her with the kind of concern reserved for people making obviously poor decisions. Jennifer met her at the elevator, took in Claire's exhausted appearance and the wrapped radio with professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide surprise. She was exactly as Claire remembered, mid-40s Korean-American, dressed in business casual that somehow looked more authoritative than most people's formal wear. They'd bonded at Whitmore over shared frustration with institutional resistance to ethical investing, a friendship built on mutual respect rather than proximity. "Claire, it's good to see you, though I wish the circumstances were different." Jennifer helped maneuver the radio into a conference room where afternoon light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Before we unwrap this, I need to know, are you absolutely certain about what you found? I counted them 3 times. 120 bonds, Series E, $10,000 face value each. Issue date March 1952. Plus documentation from my father explaining their origin. Jennifer pulled on cotton gloves, the kind archivists use for handling delicate documents. Then let's see what we're dealing with. Claire unwrapped the radio, its wooden case gleaming despite decades in storage. Jennifer circled it slowly, examining construction details with the eye of someone who understood that authentication began with context. She photographed it from multiple angles before Claire removed the bottom panel and fall space, revealing the bonds exactly as they'd been discovered. Jennifer's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Claire already knew. This was real, significant, potentially life-changing. She lifted the first bond with reverence, typically reserved for religious artifacts, holding it to the light, examining paper quality, printing details, serial numbers. The paper stock is correct for 1952 series E-bonds. Cotton fiber content, specific weight. The printing appears authentic, intaglio process, proper treasury seal placement. Serial numbers are sequential, which matches your father's story about purchasing them together. She set down the first bond, picked up another, repeated the examination. Claire, I'm not a certified authenticator, but based on 15 years evaluating financial instruments, these look legitimate. They spent the next hour cataloging everything. Each bond photographed and logged, documentation reviewed and cross-referenced. Jennifer took notes in precise handwriting that filled page after page of legal pads. When she finally sat back, her expression carried weight that went beyond professional assessment. Assuming authentication confirms what I believe to be true, we're looking at substantial value. But the calculation is more complex than simple maturity schedules. Series E bonds stopped earning interest after 40 years, which would have been 1992 for these. However, there are redemption quirks specific to bonds purchased in the early 1950s. She pulled up spreadsheets on her laptop, typing numbers that made the screen fill with calculations Claire's analyst brain struggled to process. 1952 was a unique year for Series E bonds. Purchase price was 75% of face value, meaning your father paid $90,000 for $120,000 in bonds. Standard appreciation would bring final value to approximately $240,000 total after 40 years. Claire's stomach dropped. $240,000 was still life-changing money, but nowhere near the million she'd calculated. That's significantly less than I thought. Let me finish. Jennifer's fingers continued moving across the keyboard. However, there was a little-known provision for bonds purchased through certain defense contract employers. Zenith. Radio had special arrangements with Treasury for employees working on classified projects. Those bonds earned enhanced interest rates, 4.2% instead of the standard 2.9%. New numbers appeared on the screen. Jennifer turned the laptop so Claire could see the final calculation. If your father's bonds qualified for enhanced rates, and his documentation suggests they did, final maturity value would be approximately $16.7 million. The number sat there on the screen, impossible and absolute. $16.7 million. Claire's vision tunneled, peripheral awareness dropping away until only those digits existed. She heard herself breathing, loud in the suddenly quiet room. Jennifer's hand found her shoulder, warm and grounding. Claire, look at me. Breathe. 16 million. Potentially. We need authentication, confirmation of the enhanced rate qualification, legal verification of ownership. But yes, if everything checks out, somewhere in the range of $16 to $17 million. Claire's hands shook as she gripped the conference table edge. That's not real. People don't find that kind of money in old radios. I'm having a breakdown. This is what breakdowns feel like. You're not having a breakdown. You're processing shock, which is completely normal. Jennifer moved to the side cabinet, poured water from a pitcher into a glass, placed it in Claire's hand with the firmness of someone who wouldn't accept refusal. Drink. Then we talk about next steps, because there are many and they're all time sensitive. The water helped, cold and real against the unreality of everything else. Claire drank slowly, forcing her analyst brain to engage despite the emotional chaos threatening to overwhelm rational thought. Jennifer sat across from her, professional distance maintained, but genuine concern visible beneath it. First priority is authentication. I've already contacted Dr. Raymond Chun at the Philadelphia Numismatic Society. He specializes in government securities and World War II era bonds. He can examine these tomorrow morning, provide preliminary assessment within 48 hours. How much does that cost? The question emerged automatically, poverty thinking that hadn't adjusted to the possibility that cost might no longer matter. His standard fee is $500 for preliminary examination, $2,000 for comprehensive authentication with written certification. We pay it from my operating account, deduct it from your settlement when bonds are redeemed. You don't pay anything up front. Claire nodded, the logistics making sense even as the larger implications remained too large to fully comprehend. What else? Legal documentation of ownership. Your father's letter and a 1985 affidavit are strong supporting evidence. But we need formal verification that the bonds were legally acquired, properly registered, and legitimately transferred to you through his estate. I'm contacting Sarah Chun, no relation to Raymond. She's an estate attorney who specializes in complex asset transfers. Jennifer pulled up contact information on her phone, started typing messages with the efficiency of someone who'd navigated complicated financial situations before. Sarah's excellent. She handled the Pemberton estate 3 years ago, $40 million in assets tied up for decades because the original owner had been paranoid about government confiscation. She untangled everything, got the heirs their inheritance with minimal loss to fees and taxes. Fees and taxes. Claire's mind started working through implications. How much will that cost? How much will I actually keep? Rough estimate, assuming $16 million total value. Federal estate tax doesn't apply because the bonds were gifted before your father's death through his will, but you'll pay capital gains on the appreciation from face value to redemption value. That's roughly 20% federal plus 3% state on approximately $15.88 million in gains. Call it $3.7 million in taxes. Claire did the math automatically. $16 million minus $3.7 million left $12.3 million. Still an impossible amount. Still enough to transform every aspect of her life and Mia's future. Legal fees will run $15,000 to $30,000 depending on complexity. Authentication and financial consulting fees, another $10,000. We're looking at total costs around $50,000 maximum, probably less. You'll net somewhere north of $12 million after everything. $12 million. The number kept not making sense, kept feeling like a theoretical exercise rather than actual possibility. Claire had spent her entire career analyzing numbers this large for other people. Institutional portfolios, corporate acquisitions, trust fund distributions. She'd never imagined being on the receiving end of calculations that would fundamentally alter existence. Jennifer's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, frowned slightly. Raymond can see us tomorrow at 9 a.m. Sarah's available for consultation this afternoon if you're free. But Claire, there's something else we need to discuss before we proceed. The shift in Jennifer's tone triggered alarm bells. What? Your sister Margaret called my office this morning, before you arrived. She introduced herself as your family representative, said she was concerned about your mental state, and wanted to discuss your recent erratic behavior. Claire's chest tightened. What did you tell her? Nothing. Client confidentiality applies even to preliminary consultations. But her call suggests she's already moving to position herself as concerned family member protecting unstable sibling. That narrative can be dangerous, especially if she escalates to involving authorities. The implication was clear. Margaret could call Child Protective Services, claim Claire was making delusional decisions, use the motel living situation as evidence of parental unfitness. The radio that represented salvation could be reframed as proof of mental instability, keeping a 60-pound paperweight instead of accepting practical help. She wants the bonds. Claire said it with certainty. She doesn't know about them specifically, but she knows Dad left me something valuable. She's trying to establish grounds to claim it. Jennifer's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened with the kind of anger that came from watching people manipulate vulnerable family members. Legally, your father's estate was settled 18 months ago. Whatever he left you through private arrangements outside the formal estate process belongs to you exclusively. But family can make things complicated, especially if they claim your father wasn't competent when he made those arrangements. He was completely lucid 3 years before he died when he gave his attorney the bonds documentation. The notarized letter proves that, which is strong evidence, but not invincible. Margaret could argue he was already declining, that you influenced him, that the bonds should have been declared as estate assets and divided among all heirs. Jennifer pulled out another legal pad, started sketching strategy outlines. We need to move quickly, get authentication completed, establish clear ownership, redeem the bonds, and transfer proceeds to secured accounts before Margaret can file any legal challenges. How long will that take? Optimistically, 2 weeks for authentication, another week for legal documentation, 1 more week for Treasury to process redemption and transfer funds. Call a month minimum, possibly 6 weeks if we hit complications. A month, 6 weeks. Time frames that felt infinite when Claire had 6 days left before her motel money ran out, when Margaret was already positioning for attack, when every moment the bonds remained in Claire's possession felt like an opportunity for disaster. Can I stay here? The question emerged before Claire fully thought it through. Can I leave the bonds with you, in a safe or vault or whatever security you have? I can't keep them in a motel room. If Margaret shows up with authorities, claims I'm unstable, and they search the room, the bonds stay with you until authentication. Jennifer's tone brooked no argument. Chain of custody matters for legal verification. Raymond needs to examine them in situ, needs you to testify about discovery circumstances. After authentication, yes, we secure them in a safety deposit box until redemption. They were interrupted by Jennifer's assistant, a young woman with bright purple hair who stuck her head in the conference room. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a man in the lobby asking for Claire Meadows. Says he's her brother Richard. He's pretty insistent. Claire's pulse spiked. Richard. Margaret must have called him immediately after leaving the motel, coordinated this ambush. Her brother was a corporate attorney, specialized in hostile takeovers and asset protection. If he was here, he wasn't making a family welfare check. Jennifer stood smoothly, professional armor sliding into place. Tell him Miss Meadows is in a confidential client consultation. If he wishes to schedule an appointment, he can call tomorrow during business hours. He says it's urgent family business, that Claire's not answering her phone. Then he can leave a message. Jennifer's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made arguments seem futile. When not to be disturbed, after the assistant left, Jennifer locked the conference room door with deliberate finality. We're going to assume Margaret and Richard are coordinating strategy. That means we accelerate our timeline. Work on the assumption that they'll file legal challenges the moment they confirm the bonds exist. How would they confirm that? I haven't told them anything. Your father's attorney, Arthur Pemberton. If they pressure him, claim they need estate information for tax purposes or family settlement, he might mention the radio delivery. From there, it's not a huge leap to suspect something valuable was hidden inside. Claire pulled out her phone, saw 3 missed calls from Richard's number, 2 from Margaret, 1 from a number she didn't recognize. No voicemails, just the persistent attempts to reach her that suggested urgency bordering on desperation. Jennifer noticed her looking at the phone. Don't answer. Don't engage. Every conversation is an opportunity for them to gather information or get you to say something they can use against you. From this moment forward, all communication with your siblings goes through legal counsel. I don't have legal counsel. You're about to. Jennifer was already dialing. Phone pressed her ear. Sarah, it's Jennifer Park. I need you to take on a client immediately. Estate matter, high-value asset discovery, family complications that require aggressive protection. Yes, she's here now. Perfect. We'll be there in 20 minutes. Sarah Chen's office was an old city, a restored colonial building that had probably housed Benjamin Franklin-era merchants. The historical setting seemed appropriate for dealing with bonds older than most people's grandparents. Sarah herself was mid-30s, Chinese-American, wearing a power suit that communicated competence before she spoke a word. She listened to Claire's story with the focused intensity of someone trained to extract critical details from emotional narratives. Occasionally, she'd interrupt with questions that seemed tangential but weren't. Did your father have any diagnosed dementia before death? Were you named in his original will filed with the court? Had you visited him regularly during his final year? Each question designed to preempt arguments Margaret and Richard might make, to establish Claire's position as legitimate heir rather than manipulative opportunist. When Claire finished, Sarah sat back in her leather chair, fingers steepled in a gesture that suggested she was calculating odds, strategies, counter-moves. Your siblings will argue that bonds of this value should have been declared as estate assets, that hiding them constitutes fraud against other heirs, that you unduly influence your father to exclude them from the inheritance. I didn't know about the bonds until yesterday. I had no idea Dad had anything beyond his pension, which is your strongest defense. But we need to be prepared for aggressive tactics. Family litigation over unexpected inheritances gets ugly fast, especially when we're talking about millions of dollars. Sarah pulled out forms, started filling in details with precise handwriting. I'm filing a declaratory judgment action today, asking the court to confirm your sole ownership of the bonds based on your father's explicit written instructions. This gets us on offense rather than defense, forces them to respond to our framing rather than vice versa. Won't that alert them to the bond's existence? They already know something's up, or Richard wouldn't be camped in Jennifer's lobby. Better to control the narrative from the start than let them build a case in secret. Sarah's pen moved across legal forms with practiced efficiency. We'll also file for emergency protective order preventing any party from interfering with authentication and redemption processes. Standard practice in disputed estate matters. The legal machinery was engaging, grinding into motion with momentum Claire couldn't quite believe. 24 hours ago, she'd been counting change for bus fare. Now attorneys were filing federal motions on her behalf, protecting assets worth more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes. How much is this going to cost? The poverty question again, instinctive despite Jennifer's earlier reassurances. Sarah glanced at Jennifer, some unspoken communication passing between them. Standard contingency arrangement. I take 8% of recovered assets after successful resolution, nothing if we lose. Given the value involved, my fee would be approximately $960,000, assuming $12 million net recovery. The number should have seemed outrageous. Instead, it felt like proof that professionals believed this was real, that they were willing to invest time and expertise against future payment rather than requiring money Claire didn't have. Okay, yes, whatever you need to do. Sarah's smile carried grim satisfaction. Then let's make sure your father's wishes are honored and your siblings learn that greed doesn't always pay. They spent the next 2 hours going through documentation, Claire signing forms and affidavits, Sarah asking questions that build a comprehensive record of everything surrounding the bond's discovery and her father's intentions. By the time they finished, Claire's hand ached from signing her name dozens of times, and her mind felt overloaded with legal terminology that would have been incomprehensible 24 hours earlier. Jennifer walked her to the lobby, where Richard was no longer waiting, but had left a business card with a handwritten note on the back. Claire, we need to talk about Dad's estate. Call me immediately. This is important for Mia's sake. The implied threat made Claire's jaw tighten, using her daughter as leverage, suggesting that not cooperating somehow endangered Mia. The manipulation was transparent but effective, triggering every maternal protection instinct Claire possessed. He's already positioning this as about Mia's welfare, Jennifer observed, reading the note over Claire's shoulder. Classic strategy. Make it about the child. Imply you're being selfish by not sharing. Mia's my daughter. Dad left the bonds to me specifically for her future. I know, but family court judges are unpredictable when siblings claim concern for children's welfare. We document everything, create paper trail showing you're acting in Mia's best interest while they're motivated by greed. Claire pocketed the business card without responding to it. She'd learned that lesson already. Don't engage, don't provide ammunition, let attorneys handle communication. Though every instinct screamed to defend herself, to make Richard and Margaret understand that she wasn't stealing anything, she was honoring their father's explicit wishes. The radio went back to the motel, wrapped in blankets, this time transported in Jennifer's Range Rover with climate control and careful handling. They carried it up the stairs together, Jennifer insisting on helping despite Claire's protests about having already imposed too much. Inside the room, Jennifer examined the accommodations with the same analytical eye she'd applied to the bonds. Claire braced for judgment, for the kind of pity she'd seen in Margaret's expression. Instead, Jennifer just nodded, accepting the reality without commentary. You'll need somewhere more secure than this before authentication tomorrow. Do you have friends you could stay with? Claire's mind went blank. Friends had evaporated when her employment situation became public, when the whispers about instability made people uncomfortable. Social connections in adulthood were fragile things, maintained through professional proximity and shared circumstances. Remove those, and you discovered how shallow most friendships actually were. No, there's no one. Jennifer pulled out her phone, typed something quickly. My sister has a rental property in Fishtown that's currently vacant. 2-bedroom row house, fully furnished. She's asking $1,800 monthly, but I can get you in there for $600 given the circumstances. First month paid from my operating account, deducted from your eventual settlement. The generosity overwhelmed Claire's remaining composure. She'd spent weeks navigating a world that had systematically rejected her. Employers, landlords, even family. Having someone offer help without judgment or ulterior motive felt almost suspicious, except Jennifer's expression showed nothing but practical problem solving. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm offering. And it's not charity, it's pragmatic business decision. Can't properly authenticate bonds when my client is living in circumstances that undermine her credibility. You need stable housing before we go before any judge. They moved that afternoon, Claire and Mia packing their few belongings into garbage bags that had become too familiar. The row house was modest but clean, with actual bedrooms and a kitchen that included full-size appliances. Mia ran through it with excitement that broke Claire's heart and repaired it simultaneously. Mom, I have my own room, with a real bed, and there's a backyard. The backyard was 10 by 15 feet of concrete with weeds growing through cracks. But to Mia, it represented freedom from motel confinement. Claire watched her daughter explore, feeling the first genuine hope she'd experienced in months. This could work. This could actually work. The radio sat in the living room, still wrapped, still protecting its secret. Tomorrow morning, Dr. Raymond Chen would examine it, begin the authentication process that would either confirm the bond's legitimacy or reveal them as elaborate forgery. Claire's father had been many things, distant, obsessed, difficult to understand, but he'd never been a liar or fantasist. She had to trust that his careful documentation, his methodical preservation, his engineer's precision had been applied to something real. Had to believe that his final gift was genuine rather than one more disappointment in a year that had specialized in them. That evening, after Mia was asleep in her new bedroom, Claire unwrapped the radio and removed the bonds one more time. She needed to confirm they were real, that yesterday's discovery hadn't been desperation-induced hallucination. The bonds looked exactly as they had before, old paper, careful printing, sequential serial numbers marching across 120 individual certificates. She pulled up her father's letter, read it again in the quiet house. You have your mother's integrity, her inability to compromise on what matters. That quality will cost you everything, then save you. Her phone rang at 9:37 p.m., Margaret's number. Claire let it ring through to voicemail, then listened to the message with grim satisfaction. Claire, it's Margaret. I know you're avoiding me, which is childish and concerning. Richard and I have been talking to Dad's attorney. We know he left you something significant, and we know you're being selfish about it. Dad wouldn't have wanted you to cut us out. We're family. We deserve to be included in whatever he left, especially since Richard and I were the ones who took care of him when you were too busy with your career. Call me back. We can work this out as adults, or we can involve lawyers and judges. Your choice. The message was perfect in its way, combining guilt, threat, and complete historical revisionism. Margaret had visited their father perhaps 6 times in his final year. Richard had sent a check monthly, but hadn't seen him in person since Christmas 3 years before he died. Claire had driven from Philadelphia every other weekend, handled medical appointments, managed assisted living arrangements. But none of that would matter to Margaret and Richard. They'd convinced themselves of their own narrative where they'd been dutiful children and Claire had been distant. And now she was stealing what rightfully belonged to everyone. Claire, save the message. Sarah had said document everything. This counted as documentation. Morning arrived too quickly and too slowly simultaneously. Claire dressed in the most professional outfit she still owned. Suit from her Whitmore days, slightly outdated but clean and appropriate. Mia went to school with promises that yes, this was their house now. Yes, she could invite Sophie over sometime. Yes, everything was getting better. Dr. Raymond Chun worked from an office in Society Hill, a converted townhouse that served as both residence and place of business. He answered the door himself. Late 60s, Chinese-American, wearing archival gloves and carrying a jeweler's loop on a chain around his neck. Miss Meadows, Jennifer spoke highly of your situation. Please bring the radio inside. His examination room looked like something between museum conservation lab and bank vault. Climate-controlled, humidity-monitored, examination equipment that probably cost more than Claire's car had been worth. He directed her to place the radio on a padded examination table, then spent 10 minutes just photographing it from every angle before attempting to open it. 1952 Zenith console radio, Model Z, 7243R, beautiful piece, extremely well maintained. His hands moved with practiced care, removing the bottom panel with tools designed for delicate work. The base construction is unusual. This modification wasn't original to the design. My father built this specific radio. He worked at the Zenith plant in the early 50s. Dr. Chin's expression shifted, professional interest intensifying. Then these modifications were done by someone with access to proper equipment and materials. The false bottom is expertly crafted, designed to be undetectable without specific knowledge. Whoever built this understood counter-surveillance engineering. He lifted the false bottom, revealing the bonds in their careful stacks. His sharp intake of breath suggested he'd been briefed on what to expect, but seeing it was still shocking. The next 3 hours were meticulous examination. Dr. Chun tested paper composition, examined printing techniques, verified serial number sequences, cross-referenced Treasury Department records through databases Claire didn't know existed. Jennifer sat beside Claire in observation chairs, watching in silence as the old man worked with focused intensity that suggested he understood the stakes. Finally, around 12:30 p.m., Dr. Chun removed his examination glasses and turned to face them directly. I can provide preliminary assessment now, with comprehensive written analysis within 48 hours. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. And the bonds are authentic. Series of United States savings bonds, issued March 15, 1952, sequentially numbered E847392 through E847511. Paper stock, printing methods, serial number patterns, all consistent with Treasury standard from that era. I've verified 10% of them through direct Treasury database queries. Those 10 are listed as issued but never redeemed, registered to Robert James Meadows. The room tilted slightly. Claire gripped the chair arms, forcing herself to breathe through the relief that threatened to overwhelm her. Dr. Chun continued with clinical precision. However, there's a complication regarding valuation. Standard Series E bonds from 1952 would have matured to approximately $2.4 million total. But your father's documentation mentions enhanced interest rates through Zenith's defense contract arrangements. 4.2% instead of 2.9%, Jennifer supplied. Correct. I've contacted Treasury Department archives to verify whether these specific bonds qualified for enhanced rates. That determination requires accessing classified defense contract records from the early 1950s, which is more complicated than standard bond verification. How complicated? Claire asked. 2 to 4 weeks to get access to proper archives, assuming they still exist and weren't destroyed. However, your father's notarized letter mentioning Project Longwave gave me something to search for. I found reference to that project in declassified Army Signal Corps documents from 1952. It was a legitimate defense research initiative involving radio encryption technology. Zenith was primary contractor, and employee bonuses for that project were indeed structured through enhanced rate savings bonds. Dr. Chin pulled up documents on his computer screen, rotating the monitor so they could see. Declassified military records, faded but legible, listing Project Longwave participants and compensation structures. Robert James Meadows is listed as junior engineer, compensation tier 3, which qualified for the enhanced bond rate. Based on this documentation and the bond's authenticity, I can confidently assess total redemption value at $16.8 million, plus or minus $200,000, depending on exact interest calculation methodology Treasury applies. $16.8 million. The number was real now, certified by an expert, documented through governmental records. No longer speculation or desperate hope, but actual quantifiable wealth that belonged to Claire. Jennifer's hand found hers, squeezed briefly. Professional distance maintained, but genuine happiness visible beneath it. Congratulations, Claire. Your father's gift is legitimate and extraordinary. Dr. Chun produced preliminary certification documents, signing them with flourishes that suggested he understood their importance. I'll complete comprehensive analysis by Friday. This will serve as basis for Treasury redemption request, along with supporting documentation from your father's estate. They left his office with the bonds secured in an archival portfolio Dr. Chun provided, along with strict instructions about temperature and humidity maintenance. The safety deposit box was next step, securing everything in the most literal vault until Treasury processed redemption. Claire's phone buzzed as they walked to Jennifer's car. Text message from a number she didn't recognize. This is Richard. Margaret told me you're making claims about Dad's estate assets. We need to meet immediately. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to file legal action claiming you defrauded other heirs. This is your last chance to resolve this as family. Jennifer read it over Claire's shoulder. Forward that to Sarah immediately. That's attempted intimidation through legal threats. She'll use it to establish their predatory intent. Claire forwarded the message, then blocked Richard's number. Every interaction with her siblings felt like a trap, an attempt to gather information or create record of instability. Better to cut off all communication, let attorneys handle everything. The safety deposit box was at Citizens Bank, private vault requiring 2 keys and biometric verification to access. Jennifer had arranged it that morning. The box registered in Claire's name with Jennifer as authorized co-accessor. They secured the bonds in a climate-controlled compartment, the radio itself too large to fit, so it went home with Claire wrapped in archival materials. Standing in the vault, watching the drawer slide closed on $16.8 million in authenticated bonds, Claire felt disconnected from her body. This was happening to someone else, some protagonist in a story where desperate single mothers found impossible fortunes. Not to Claire Meadows, who'd been counting change 4 days ago. This is real, she said aloud, needing to hear the words spoken into existence. Jennifer's expression showed understanding that went beyond professional sympathy. It's real, and now the hard part begins, protecting it from everyone who'll try to take it from you. Sarah Chun filed the declaratory judgment action that afternoon, court documents asking a judge to confirm Claire's sole ownership of the bonds based on Robert Meadows' explicit written instructions. The filing became public record immediately, which meant Richard and Margaret would know about it within hours. The response came faster than expected. Sarah called at 6:47 p.m. while Claire was making dinner for Mia, her voice carrying the tight satisfaction of someone who'd predicted an opponent's move correctly. They filed a counterclaim. Richard and Margaret are asserting that the bonds should have been declared as estate assets, that your father lacked mental capacity when he arranged their concealment, and that all 3 children are entitled to equal shares. They're also requesting emergency custody evaluation from Mia, claiming your recent erratic behavior and unstable living situation posed danger to her welfare. The floor dropped out from under Claire's world. They're trying to take Mia? They're trying to pressure you into settling. Family court custody threats are standard intimidation tactics in estate disputes. But we need to take it seriously, document everything showing you're a fit parent, providing stable home environment. Claire looked around the row house, clean, safe, with actual bedrooms and working appliances. Mia was at the kitchen table doing homework, happy and healthy, and completely unaware that her aunt and uncle were trying to weaponize child welfare laws against her mother. What do I do? Tomorrow morning, we meet with Child Protective Services voluntarily. Request evaluation on your terms rather than theirs. Show them the house, your employment situation improving, Mia's school records showing stable performance. Preempt their narrative before it takes hold. That night, after Mia was asleep, Claire sat in the living room with her father's radio playing softly. Big band music from an era when the world had been simpler, or at least differently complicated. The radio had protected its secret for 70 years, waiting for the moment when she'd need it desperately enough to look beyond surface value. She thought about her father's letter, his warning that trust was earned rather than given, his understanding that money revealed character instead of creating it. Margaret and Richard were proving his wisdom with every legal filing, every threat veiled as family concern. Her phone buzzed. Text from Jennifer. Sarah filed response to their custody petition. Judge scheduled emergency hearing for Monday 9 a.m. Be prepared to testify about Mia's welfare and your fitness as parent. Dress professionally, bring school records, doctor's notes, anything showing stable care. 4 days until the hearing. 4 days to prepare for a fight that would determine whether she kept her daughter while protecting the inheritance her father had intended for exactly this purpose. Claire pulled up the photo of her father she kept on her phone. The last one she'd taken 3 months before he died, him sitting in his assisted living room with the Zenith radio beside him. He'd been smiling, something rare in those final months. Like he knew something no one else did. Like he'd been keeping a secret that gave him private satisfaction. "I hope I'm doing this right, Dad," she whispered to the image. "I hope I'm strong enough for what you trusted me to handle." The radio played on, filling the house with music from another time, and Claire sat in the darkness, gathering strength for battles she'd never imagined fighting. The bonds were real, the money was coming, but first she had to prove to a judge that she deserved to keep her daughter. Everything else was just money. Mia was everything that mattered. The fight was just beginning. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation that felt like studying for an exam where failure meant losing everything that mattered. Sarah Chun arrived Saturday morning with a legal assistant and a checklist that covered 3 pages. Documents to gather, statements to draft, witnesses to contact, every detail that might matter when a judge decided whether Claire was fit to parent her own daughter. Family court is unpredictable, Sarah explained as they sat at Claire's kitchen table. Mia, playing in the backyard where she couldn't overhear. Judges have enormous discretion in custody matters. We need to demonstrate not just that you're adequate, but that removing Mia from your care would be actively harmful. They compiled evidence methodically. Mia's school records showing straight A's and perfect attendance, except for the brief period during the transition between schools. Letters from teachers praising her adjustment and academic performance. Medical records documenting regular checkups and current vaccinations. Character references from the motel manager who'd watched Claire work double shifts while keeping Mia safe and cared for. Jennifer arrived around noon with her own contribution, employment offer letter from her firm. Position title is Client Services Coordinator, salary $65,000 annually, starting immediately. It's a real job with real responsibilities, not charity dressed up as employment. You'll be managing client communications and coordinating with financial service providers. Claire stared at the letter, her throat tight. Jennifer, you don't have to. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm hiring someone with 15 years of financial analysis experience who I know is competent and ethical. The fact that you're also my client doesn't change that you're qualified. Jennifer's tone brooked no argument. Plus, it gives you documented stable employment to show the judge. That matters. Sarah nodded approvingly. Employment history shows responsibility and planning for future stability. This is good. By Sunday evening, they had a file 3 inches thick. Evidence of Claire's fitness as a parent, her proactive steps toward financial stability, her daughter's thriving despite recent hardships. Sarah organized it with tabs and summary sheets, preparing to overwhelm the judge with documentation before Margaret and Richard could establish their narrative. What are they going to argue? Claire asked as they reviewed final preparations. That you're mentally unstable, evidenced by getting fired from your previous job and making irrational decisions like keeping a worthless radio instead of accepting practical help. That you exposed Mia to unsafe living conditions in that motel. That sudden claims about hidden millions demonstrate delusional thinking or fraud. That Mia would be better off in their care while you get psychiatric evaluation. Sarah's expression hardened. It's all bullshit, but it sounds plausible to someone who doesn't know the full context. The bonds are authenticated. That's not delusion. They'll claim you forged the authentication, or that the bonds are worthless despite what experts say, or that believing you're entitled to millions without sharing with family demonstrates narcissistic personality disorder. They'll twist everything, make you sound like you're having a breakdown. Claire's hands clenched into fists under the table. I lost my job because I refused to commit fraud. I kept the radio because my father specifically requested it. The bonds are real and legally mine. How is any of that unstable? It's not. But presented the right way to the right judge, it can be made to sound concerning. Sarah softened slightly, recognizing Claire's rising panic, which is why we have 3 inches of documentation proving otherwise. We're going to win this, Claire. Your siblings overplayed their hand by going after custody. Judges don't like family members weaponizing child welfare for financial gain. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, November asserting itself with wind that cut through Claire's professional suit. Sarah had coached her on courtroom behavior. Calm, respectful, answer only what's asked, don't volunteer information, make eye contact with the judge, show confidence without arrogance. Mia stayed with Jennifer's sister, kept out of the courtroom, where she wouldn't hear her mother's fitness debated like a legal abstraction. Claire had hugged her that morning with intensity that made Mia pull back, confused. Mom, you're squishing me. What's wrong? Nothing, baby. Just love you so much. I love you too. Why are you wearing your fancy suit? Meeting with some people about Grandpa's estate. Boring adult stuff. The lie sat bitter but necessary. Mia didn't need to know her aunt and uncle were trying to take her away. Didn't need that fear planted in her 10-year-old mind. The courthouse was family court division, a building that had seen countless custody battles, each one representing someone's worst day. Sarah met Claire on the steps, carrying the evidence file and wearing her own armor of professional attire. Richard and Margaret are already inside with their attorney, Mark Davidson. He specializes in contested estates and custody litigation. He's good, but he's working with weak facts. Remember, calm, honest, don't let him provoke you. The courtroom was smaller than Claire expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic spaces she'd seen on television. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her early 60s with gray hair and an expression suggesting she'd heard every excuse and manipulation humans could devise. Richard and Margaret sat on the opposite side with their attorney, a man in his 40s wearing a suit that probably cost more than Claire's monthly salary at Whitmore. They didn't look at Claire when she entered, maintaining the pretense that this was about Mia's welfare rather than money. Judge Morrison called the session to order with brisk efficiency. This is an emergency custody evaluation hearing regarding Mia Meadows, age 10, currently in sole custody of her mother Claire Meadows. Petitioners Richard Meadows and Margaret Connolly are requesting temporary custody transfer pending full psychiatric evaluation of the mother. Ms. Chun, you're representing Claire Meadows. Yes, Your Honor. We oppose this petition on grounds that it's frivolous harassment designed to coerce financial concessions in an unrelated estate dispute. That's a serious allegation. Judge Morrison's gaze moved to Davidson. Mr. Davidson, your client's position? Davidson stood with practiced ease. Your Honor, this is solely about a child's welfare. My clients are concerned their sister is experiencing mental health crisis following job loss, eviction, and bankruptcy. Their concern is heightened by Miss Meadows' recent behavior, refusing family assistance, keeping worthless furniture instead of accepting practical help, making grandiose claims about hidden millions, isolating herself from family support networks. What grandiose claims? Miss Meadows claims to have discovered bonds worth $16 million hidden in an old radio. She's hired attorneys, filed legal actions against family members, exhibits signs of paranoid delusion or fraudulent scheming. Either way, my clients believe their niece is being exposed to an unstable situation that warrants immediate intervention. Judge Morrison turned to Sarah. Miss Chun, how do you respond to the allegation about mental instability? Sarah stood, and Claire felt a small surge of confidence in the attorney's controlled fury. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence establishing that Miss Meadows' claims are not delusional, but fully substantiated by expert authentication. She approached the bench with Dr. Raymond Chen's certification, along with Treasury Department records, confirming the bond's existence and registration to Robert Meadows. Judge Morrison examined them with increasing focus, her expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. These appear to be legitimate government documents certifying bonds valued at nearly $17 million. Correct, Your Honor. The bonds are authentic series e-savings bonds issued in 1952, properly registered to Miss Meadows' deceased father and legally transferred to her through his estate. Far from being delusional, Miss Meadows has acted with appropriate caution and diligence in securing professional authentication before making claims about the assets. Davidson interjected smoothly. Your Honor, the bond's existence, if they're real, actually strengthens our concern. Assets of this magnitude belong to the entire estate, not just Miss Meadows. Her attempt to conceal them from other heirs demonstrates problematic judgment and willingness to prioritize greed over family relationships. The bonds were not part of the probated estate, Sarah countered. Robert Meadows explicitly arranged their transfer outside the formal estate process through sealed instructions to his attorney. His written documentation, notarized 3 years before death, clearly states the bonds are intended solely for Claire Meadows and her daughter Mia. Judge Morrison held up a hand. I'm less concerned with estate distribution than with the child's welfare. Miss Meadows, please stand. Claire stood, forcing her hands not to shake, meeting the judge's assessing gaze with as much confidence as she could manufacture. Miss Meadows, your siblings claim you've been living in a motel with your daughter. Is that accurate? It was accurate until last Wednesday, Your Honor. Following my bankruptcy and eviction, the motel was our only affordable option. As of last week, Mia and I are living in a 2-bedroom row house in Fishtown with stable month-to-month tenancy. Employment status? I was terminated from Whitmore Financial Group 6 weeks ago. As of this morning, I'm employed as Client Services Coordinator at Park Wealth Management. Annual salary, $65,000. Judge Morrison made notes, her expression unreadable. The rapid change in circumstances is notable. Some might say, suspiciously convenient timing. Sarah interjected carefully. Your Honor, if I may, the circumstances changed because Miss Meadows sought appropriate professional help rather than making impulsive decisions. Upon discovering the bonds, she immediately consulted financial advisors and legal counsel to ensure proper handling. The employment offer came from Jennifer Park, a former colleague who can attest to Miss Meadows' professional competence and ethical conduct. Is Mississippi Park present? Jennifer stood from the gallery where she'd been sitting quietly. Yes, Your Honor. I'm happy to testify to Miss Meadows' qualifications and character. The judge gestured for her to approach. Jennifer was sworn in, took the witness chair with the composed confidence of someone who'd testified before in various professional capacities. Mississippi Park, you're offering employment to someone who was recently terminated from their previous position. Why? Because I know why she was terminated, Your Honor. Claire refused to sign off on fraudulent compliance documents at Whitmore Financial. Her termination wasn't performance-related. It was retaliation for refusing to participate in securities fraud. I consider her ethical stance to be evidence of exactly the kind of judgment I want in my employees. Davidson stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. These are unsubstantiated allegations about Miss Meadows' former employer. They're documented in SEC filings, Jennifer replied calmly. Whitmore Financial is currently under investigation for the Henderson Real Estate Fund matter. Claire's whistleblower complaint is part of that investigation. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. Miss Meadows filed a whistleblower complaint? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah confirmed, which is public record and further demonstrates her ethical judgment and mental stability. Far from being unstable, she risked her career to maintain professional integrity. The judge made more notes, her expression shifting in ways Claire couldn't interpret. Mr. Davidson, what specific evidence do you have of Miss Meadows being an unfit parent? Davidson pulled out his own file. Temporary homelessness, Your Honor. Exposing a 10-year-old to motel living and school instability. Obsessive attachment to worthless furniture. The furniture wasn't worthless, Judge Morrison interrupted. It contained $17 million in authenticated bonds. That seems like appropriate attachment. We dispute the bond's value and legitimacy. You can dispute all you want, but the Treasury Department doesn't issue fraudulent authentication certificates. The judge's tone had cooled noticeably. What else? Davidson shifted tactics. Miss Meadows has cut off all contact with family support networks. She's isolated herself and her daughter, refuses reasonable offers of assistance, exhibits paranoid ideation regarding her siblings' motives. Sarah stood. Your Honor, I have documentation showing the nature of those reasonable offers. May I present text messages and voicemail transcripts? She approached with printouts of Richard's threatening texts and Margaret's voicemail about involving lawyers and judges, along with Margaret's attempt to take the radio against Claire's explicit refusal. Judge Morrison read them with an expression that grew progressively less sympathetic to the petitioners. These communications suggest financial motivation rather than genuine concern for the child's welfare. Mr. Davidson, I'm not seeing evidence that Mia is in danger or being neglected. Your Honor, we request supervised visitation at minimum, along with psychiatric evaluation of Miss Meadows to establish her current mental state. Judge Morrison sat back, fingers steepled in the gesture Sarah had taught Claire a judge was reaching decision. Here's what I see. Miss Meadows experienced financial hardship following principled whistleblower action against her employer. She sought temporary shelter that, while not ideal, kept her daughter safe and in school. Upon discovering legitimate inherited assets, she immediately consulted professionals and followed appropriate legal procedures. She secured stable housing and employment. Meanwhile, her siblings have weaponized custody concerns in what appears to be transparent attempt to gain leverage in a state dispute. She looked directly at Richard and Margaret. I don't appreciate my courtroom being used to intimidate parties in financial disagreements. Custody proceedings exist to protect children, not to threaten parents into surrendering assets. Davidson started to object, but Judge Morrison cut him off. I'm denying the emergency custody petition. Miss Meadows retains full custody of her daughter. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing further harassment or intimidation attempts by the petitioners. Any future contact regarding the child goes through legal counsel only. Relief flooded Claire's system with enough force to make her knees weak. Sarah's hand found her elbow, steadying her as the judge continued. Regarding the estate dispute, that's not my jurisdiction. Take it to probate court if you want to contest the bond's distribution, but leave the child out of it. We're adjourned. The gavel came down with finality that felt like absolution. Claire had won. Mia was safe. The bonds were acknowledged as real, even by a skeptical judge. Richard and Margaret had overplayed their hand and lost credibility in the process. Sarah gathered their materials efficiently. That went better than expected. Judge Morrison saw through their strategy immediately. They exited the courtroom to find Richard and Margaret in the hallway, Davidson speaking to them in low, urgent tones that suggested damage control. Margaret's face was flushed with anger. Richard's expression locked in professional neutrality that didn't quite hide his fury. Sarah steered Claire past them without engagement, but Margaret's voice cut across the hallway with venom that made other lawyers turn to look. "This isn't over, Claire. You're stealing from your own family, poisoning Mia against her relatives. Dad would be ashamed of what you've become." Claire stopped despite Sarah's gentle pressure to keep moving. She turned slowly, meeting her sister's eyes with composure she'd learned from watching Jennifer and Sarah maintain professional calm under pressure. "Dad left explicit written instructions that the bonds were for me and Mia alone. He knew you'd react exactly like this, trying to take what isn't yours, using family guilt as a weapon. You're proving him right with every legal filing, every threat, every manipulation. We deserve equal shares. We're his children too. Then maybe you should have visited him more than 6 times in his final year. Maybe you should have handled his medical appointments and assisted living arrangements instead of leaving everything to me. Maybe you should have actually cared about him instead of just his money." Richard stepped forward, his attorney persona fully engaged. "This is exactly the kind of emotional instability we were describing to the judge. You're being irrational, Claire. Dad's estate should be divided equally. That's basic fairness. The estate was divided equally. You both got equal shares of what was in the probated estate. His pension remainder, his personal effects, the proceeds from selling his assisted living furniture. These bonds were never part of that estate. Dad hid them specifically so you couldn't claim them. Because you manipulated him," Margaret hissed. "You made him think we didn't care, turned him against his own children." Sarah's voice cut through the escalation with professional ice. "This conversation is over. My client has a restraining order protecting her from your harassment. Any further contact will be reported to Judge Morrison and may result in contempt charges. Mr. Davidson, control your clients." They walked away, leaving Richard and Margaret in the hallway with their attorney attempting to calm them. Claire's hands shook from adrenaline dump, the confrontation having required every ounce of courage she'd managed to summon. Outside the courthouse, Sarah's expression showed grim satisfaction. That outburst in the hallway was perfect. If they try anything else, we have witnesses to their threatening behavior. What happens now with the estate claim? They'll probably file in probate court, argue the bond should have been declared as estate assets. We'll counter with your father's explicit written instructions and the timing of the concealment. He hid them decades before death, long before any question of mental competency. It's a weak case, but they'll pursue it out of spite, if nothing else. Jennifer joined them on the sidewalk, having exited through a different door to avoid the confrontation. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know." "Relieved? Exhausted? Angry that this is what family becomes when money is involved?" All of those are appropriate responses. Jennifer checked her phone. "We should celebrate the custody victory, but we also need to move forward with bond redemption. The longer this drags out, the more opportunities they have to cause problems." They returned to Sarah's office to plan next steps. The bonds were authenticated. Claire's ownership was legally defensible, but converting them to actual money required navigating Treasury Department bureaucracy that hadn't been designed for 70-year-old securities. Sarah had already begun the process, filing redemption requests through proper channels. Treasury estimates 4 to 6 weeks for processing. They'll verify the bonds one more time, confirm no liens or claims against them, calculate final interest, and transfer funds to your designated account. 6 weeks. The timeline felt both fast and glacially slow. What if Richard and Margaret file legal claims that freeze the redemption? They can try, but Judge Morrison's ruling today helps us. She acknowledged the bonds as legitimate and yours. Any probate judge will see that family court already reviewed the situation and found in your favor. Sarah pulled up legal precedents on her laptop. Plus, bonds are bearer instruments up until the point of redemption. Once Treasury processes the redemption and transfers funds, it becomes much harder for anyone to claw back the money. Jennifer added practical considerations. While we wait for redemption, you need to make financial decisions. How do you want the money structured once it arrives? Investments, trusts, immediate liquidity. The question was too large for Claire's exhausted brain to process. $16 million required strategies she'd analyze for clients but never imagined needing for herself. Investment allocations, tax optimization, estate planning, trust structures for Mia's future. I need time to think about it. Right now, I just want to survive until the money actually arrives. That's fair, Jennifer allowed. But start thinking about it. $16 million properly invested generates roughly $640,000 in annual returns at conservative 4% rates. That's life-changing money that requires responsible planning. Claire's phone buzzed. Text from a number she'd blocked. Richard had found a new number to contact her from. The message was brief and threatening. You'll regret this. Family means everything, and you just destroyed yours for greed. She showed it to Sarah, who photographed it for documentation. Forward all harassment to me. Don't respond, don't engage. Let him shout into the void. That evening, Claire picked up Mia from Jennifer's sister's house. Her daughter was bubbling with excitement about a movie they'd watched, completely unaware of the custody battle that had been raging in her name. Mom, can Sophie come over this weekend? We want to build a fort in the backyard. Of course, baby. We can do that. At the row house, they made dinner together. Real food cooked in a real kitchen. Normalcy that felt precious after months of motel microwave meals. Mia chattered about school and friends, the trauma of recent months fading as children's resilience kicked in. After Mia was asleep, Claire sat with her father's radio again, turning the dial through empty frequencies until she found a classical station playing something orchestral and complex. The music filled the house with sound that felt like company, like her father was somehow present despite being gone. She thought about Margaret's accusation that she'd stolen from family, poisoned Mia against relatives, betrayed some fundamental bond. But family had revealed itself to be conditional, loving and supportive until money entered the equation, then predatory and threatening when someone else got what they wanted. Her father had understood that, had protected his final gift from the people who would have fought over it, destroyed relationships over dollar amounts that wouldn't have actually changed their comfortable lives. Richard and Margaret were both financially secure, owned homes, had retirement accounts. They didn't need the bonds. They just couldn't stomach Claire having them exclusively. A knock at the door made Claire jump. It was after 9 p.m., unexpected visitors rare and unwelcome. She approached cautiously, checking the peephole to find Arthur Pemberton standing on her stoop looking apologetic. Mr. Pemberton, what are you doing here? Miss Meadows, I apologize for the late hour. May I come in? There's something I need to discuss with you about your father's estate. Claire let him in despite her caution, offering coffee he declined. Pemberton sat on the couch with the careful movements of an elderly man who'd had a long day. Your siblings contacted me this afternoon. They're threatening to sue me for malpractice, claiming I colluded with you to hide estate assets from legitimate heirs. It's nonsense, but it could damage my reputation in practice. Claire's stomach clenched. I'm sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this. You didn't drag me anywhere. I'm here because I need to tell you something your father made me promise not to reveal unless absolutely necessary. Pemberton pulled out an envelope from his briefcase. This is a video recording your father made 3 years ago when he first gave me the instructions about the bonds. He wanted you to have it only if your siblings tried to contest his wishes. He set up a laptop on the coffee table, loaded a video file dated April 2021. The image showed Robert Meadows in what appeared to be Pemberton's office, sitting in front of a camera with the focused intensity Claire remembered from his engineering days. If you're watching this, Claire Bear, it means Richard and Margaret are trying to take what I left you. I'm not surprised. I'd hope they'd prove me wrong, show themselves capable of grace and family loyalty. But I planned for the more likely scenario where greed won out over decency. Her father's voice was strong in the recording, no trace of the confusion that would claim him in later months. He looked directly at the camera, like he was speaking to Claire personally across time. I want to be absolutely clear about my intentions. The bonds hidden in the radio are meant for you and only you. Not because I love you more than your siblings, but because I know you'll use the money wisely. Richard has always chased status over substance. Margaret married for money and treats wealth as scoreboard. Neither of them needs $16 million, and giving it to them would only feed the worst parts of their characters. He paused, emotion crossing his face. You're different. You have your mother's integrity. When you lost your job rather than participate in fraud, I knew I'd made the right choice. That decision cost you everything, but it proved you can't be bought or compromised. That's worth more than any amount of money. The recording showed him pulling out documents, the same notarized letter Claire had found in the radio, along with additional paperwork. I'm declaring on camera, of sound mind and clear intent, that the bonds are Claire's exclusively. If Richard and Margaret contest this, I want them to know they're going against my explicit wishes. I'm disappointed they put you in a position where you need to see this recording, but I'm not surprised. Money reveals character, and theirs is exactly what I expected. He leaned closer to the camera. Claire, use the money to build something good. Provide for Mia. Create security you've never had. Maybe help other people who've been where you are now. Don't let guilt over your siblings make you share what they don't deserve. I earned that money through legitimate work 70 years ago. I protected it for 7 decades specifically for this moment. Honor that by accepting it without apologizing. The recording ended with her father's face frozen on screen, his expression showing both love and sadness. Claire realized tears were streaming down her face, grief and gratitude mixing into something she couldn't name. Pemberton closed the laptop gently. This recording is admissible in court if needed. Combined with the written documentation, it makes your ownership uncontestable. Your father knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it with full mental competency years before his death. Thank you for bringing this. I'm sorry you needed to see it, but your father was a wise man. He understood his children better than they understood themselves. Pemberton stood, preparing to leave. I'll include this recording in my response to your sibling's attorney. Once they see it, I suspect they'll drop their claims. Even Davidson isn't aggressive enough to argue against video testimony this clear. After Pemberton left, Claire sat in the darkness watching the paused image of her father's face. He'd known. He'd planned for every contingency, protected her from family members who would have destroyed her for money they didn't need. The weight of that gift, not just the bonds but the foresight and protection, felt almost heavier than the financial value. Her father had loved her enough to anticipate her needs, to build safeguards that would activate years after his death, to choose her welfare over the feelings of his other children. She owed him more than gratitude. She owed him the kind of life that justified his faith in her character. The next morning brought another development. Sarah called at 8:15 a.m., her voice carrying suppressed excitement. Davidson withdrew their probate claim. Richard and Margaret's attorney sent formal notice that they're discontinuing all legal action related to the bonds. Just like that, Pemberton sent them the video recording. Once they saw your father's explicit testimony about his intentions, they realized they had no case. Davidson probably told them continuing would just rack up legal fees with no chance of success. Claire sat down hard on the kitchen chair. It's over. The family challenges are over. We still need to complete bond redemption, but that's administrative process rather than legal fight. Treasury should have funds transferred within 4 weeks. For weeks, 28 days until $16 million became actual money in actual accounts. Until she could breathe without fear that the next phone call would bring new crisis, new challenge, new threat to the security her father had tried to give her. What do I do until then? Live your life, Sarah said simply. Start your new job, raise your daughter, plan for a future that doesn't include poverty and fear. You won. Let yourself feel that. The permission to feel victory seemed almost harder than enduring the fight. Claire had spent so many months in survival mode that the absence of immediate crisis felt disorienting. She didn't know how to exist in a world where catastrophe wasn't lurking around every corner. But she could learn. For Mia, for her father's memory, for herself, she could learn to accept security without waiting for it to be snatched away. The radio sat in the living room, its secret revealed, its purpose fulfilled. That afternoon, Claire plugged it in one more time, found a station playing music from her father's era. She sat listening as November rain drummed against the windows, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself imagine a future that extended beyond next week's rent. The bond would process, the money would arrive, and then the real work would begin, building the kind of life her father had believed she deserved, the kind that honored his sacrifice and vindicated his faith. But for now, she just listened to the music and let herself breathe. The Treasury Department processing timeline proved optimistic. What Sarah had estimated as 4 to 6 weeks stretched into 8, then 10, each day bringing new bureaucratic requirements that seemed designed to test Claire's patience and faith. Form after form, verification after verification, cross-references between departments that apparently hadn't communicated with each other since the Eisenhower administration. Claire started her position at Park Wealth Management in the second week of December, grateful for work that occupied her mind while waiting for life-altering money to materialize. The job was real. Jennifer hadn't exaggerated about legitimate responsibilities. Claire coordinated between clients and financial advisors, managed documentation for complex portfolios, applied her analytical background to problems that felt familiar despite the new context. Her coworkers treated her with the professional courtesy of people who didn't know her history, who saw only competent colleague rather than desperate single mother who'd been counting change 2 months earlier. The normalcy felt precious and fragile, like something that could shatter if she acknowledged it too directly. Mia thrived in the row house, her teachers sending home notes about improved focus and participation. Sophie became a regular visitor, the 2 girls building elaborate forts and staging performances that filled the small backyard with laughter. Claire watched her daughter reclaim childhood that had been compressed by adult worries and felt something in her chest loosen incrementally. The third week of December brought the first communication from Treasury, confirmation that the bonds had cleared final verification and were approved for redemption. Total value, including 70 years of compounded interest at the enhanced defense contract rate, $16,847,293.18. Claire stared at the number on the official letterhead, her hands trembling despite having known this was coming. $16,847,293.18. Specific down to the penny, real in ways that made abstract calculations suddenly concrete. Funds will be transferred to your designated account via federal wire transfer within 5 to 7 business days, the letter stated with bureaucratic understatement. Please ensure account information provided is accurate and current. She called Sarah immediately, voice shaking. The bonds cleared. They're processing the transfer. Congratulations, Claire. How does it feel? The question was harder to answer than it should have been. Relief, certainly. Gratitude toward her father for the gift and toward the professionals who'd helped her protect it. But also something like grief for the months of struggle that had been necessary to reach this point, for the version of herself who'd stood on courthouse steps with $67 and no options. I don't know yet, Claire admitted. Ask me again when the money actually arrives. 5 business days later, on December 21st, Claire received an email notification from Citizens Bank that made her heart stop. Wire transfer received. $16,847,293.18. Available balance. $16,847,293.18. She sat at her desk at Park Wealth Management staring at the screen, aware that her life had just transformed in ways she couldn't fully process. Yesterday, she'd had $3,847 in checking, enough for rent and groceries with careful budgeting. Today, she had nearly $17 million and no framework for understanding what that meant. Jennifer appeared at her cubicle entrance within minutes, having received automated notification as co-accessor on the account. It came through. Are you okay? I don't know. Should I feel different? I thought I'd feel different. You will gradually. Right now, it's just numbers on a screen. The reality takes time to sink in. Jennifer gestured toward her office. Come on. We need to make decisions about fund allocation before you go home tonight. Can't leave $17 million sitting in a checking account. They spent the next 3 hours with Jennifer and 2 financial advisors mapping out investment strategy. The conversation felt surreal, discussing municipal bond portfolios and index fund allocations for amounts that would have been theoretical exercises last month. Claire's analyst training kicked in despite the emotional overwhelm, asking questions about tax efficiency and risk tolerance, applying professional skills to personal circumstances in ways that felt like acting in a play where she'd been handed the wrong script. The advisors recommended conservative allocation given Claire's situation. Recently employed after bankruptcy, single parent with dependent child, no existing wealth to cushion market volatility. 60% in stable income-generating bonds, 30% in diversified stock index funds, 10% in money market for liquidity and emergency access. At 4% average return, conservatively invested, you're looking at annual income around $670,000 before taxes, the senior advisor explained. That's sustainable indefinitely without touching principal. You could live very comfortably on half that and reinvest the rest for compound growth. $670,000 per year. More than Claire had earned in any 5-year period of her entire career. Enough that she'd never have to worry about rent or groceries or whether she could afford to take Mia to the doctor. What about Mia's future? Claire asked. College fund, trust fund, something that ensures she's protected regardless of what happens to me. They structured a $3 million irrevocable trust for Mia, funds that would be protected from any future creditors, divorce settlements, or legal judgments. The trust would pay for educational expenses through graduate school, then distribute in stages as Mia reached 25, 30, and 35. Income from the trust would supplement whatever she earned, providing security without eliminating incentive to build her own career. Another $2 million went into liquid reserves, emergency fund on steroids, accessible within 24 hours if needed. The remaining $11.8 million was allocated according to the 60/30/10 model, spread across dozens of municipal bonds and index funds to minimize risk through diversification. By 6 p.m., Claire's entire financial life had been restructured. The checking account that had held $17 million that morning now contained $400,000, walking around money, as the advisors called it, though Claire couldn't imagine what kind of walking around required that amount. She drove home through December darkness, Philadelphia decorated for Christmas with lights and garlands that seemed brighter than previous years. Or maybe she was just noticing them for the first time in months, no longer focused entirely on survival logistics. The row house looked exactly as it had that morning. Modest, safe, adequate. Claire sat in the car for 10 minutes before going inside, trying to reconcile the fact that she could buy a mansion in the suburbs, could afford any house in Philadelphia, could walk into a real estate office tomorrow and pay cash for property that had seemed impossibly out of reach last week. But Mia was happy here. Mia had her own room and a backyard in Sophie 2 blocks away. Moving would mean new school, new friends, disruption to the stability Claire had worked so hard to establish. The money didn't have to change everything immediately. That realization felt like permission to breathe. Inside, she found Mia at the kitchen table doing homework, completely unaware that their lives had transformed. Claire watched her daughter work through math problems with focused concentration and made a decision that felt right even if it contradicted every fantasy she'd entertained about sudden wealth. Hey, baby, how was school? Good. We're doing a winter concert next week. Can you come? Of course. I wouldn't miss it. That weekend, Claire took Mia shopping. Not to the Salvation Army or discount stores that have been their standard, but to a regular department store where prices didn't require careful calculation. She decided to tell Mia about the inheritance in age-appropriate terms, wanting her daughter to understand their changed circumstances without creating entitlement or fear. "Remember Grandpa Robert's radio?" Claire began as they browsed winter coats that Mia would actually choose rather than accept as only option. "The big wooden one that plays old music?" "Right. Well, Grandpa hid something very valuable inside it. Special papers called bonds that are worth a lot of money. He left them for us, for you and me, to make sure we'd always be safe and have what we need." Mia's eyes widened with the wonder unique to 10-year-olds processing adult concepts. "How much money?" "Enough that we don't have to worry anymore. Enough for you to go to any college you want, for us to have a nice house, for me to help other people who are going through hard times like we were." "Are we rich now?" The question was asked with such innocence that Claire had to suppress a laugh. "Yes, baby. We're very fortunate. But that doesn't mean we can't buy whatever we want without thinking. Money is a responsibility, not just a way to get stuff. Grandpa gave us this gift because he trusted we'd use it wisely." Mia considered this with the seriousness she applied to important questions. "Can we still live in our house? I don't want to move away from Sophie. We can stay as long as you want. We don't have to change anything you don't want to change." They selected a winter coat that Mia chose for style rather than price, along with new clothes and shoes that fit properly rather than being sized for growth. Small changes that represented an enormous shift in Claire's mental landscape. The ability to buy what her daughter needed without calculating whether it would leave enough for groceries. At the register, when the total came to $387, Claire handed over her credit card without the anxiety that had accompanied every purchase for months. The transaction processed normally, the clerk bagging items with routine efficiency that suggested she had no idea this represented the first guilt-free shopping trip Claire had experienced since bankruptcy. Christmas approached with commercial enthusiasm that Claire had previously resented but now viewed with different perspective. She could afford gifts, could make Mia's holiday special in ways that hadn't been possible last year, when Christmas had been one small toy from the dollar store and apologies about Santa having a hard year. But excess felt wrong somehow, felt like it would dishonor the struggle they'd survived. Claire bought thoughtful presents rather than expensive ones. Art supplies Mia had mentioned wanting, books she'd shown interest in, experiences like museum memberships rather than piles of toys that would be forgotten by February. On Christmas morning, Mia's joy over modest gifts reminded Claire that children measured love in attention rather than price tags. They made pancakes together, watched movies, played games, the day perfect in its ordinariness. Claire's phone stayed silent. No calls from Richard or Margaret, no attempts to breach the restraining order or restart hostilities. The video recording of their father's testimony had apparently convinced them that fighting was futile. Or perhaps they'd simply written Claire off, decided she was dead to them, the price of choosing integrity over family unity. Either way, the silence felt like relief. January brought new year and new possibilities. Jennifer suggested Claire consider what she wanted to do with her life now that survival wasn't consuming all available energy. The job at Park Wealth Management was good, but it was also clearly temporary, training ground rather than destination. You could go back to financial analysis, Jennifer offered over coffee in her office. Firms would hire you in a heartbeat now that the whistleblower complaint has vindicated your position at Whitmore. Claire considered it. She'd love the analytical work, the puzzle-solving aspect of evaluating complex portfolios. But returning to corporate finance felt like regression, going back to a world that had chewed her up and spit her out. "I want to do something that matters," she said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. "Something that helps people in the position I was in 2 months ago." "Like what?" "Financial literacy programs for people in crisis." Bankruptcy doesn't mean you're stupid with money. Sometimes it means you got sick or divorced or laid off at exactly the wrong time. But once you're in the system, no one teaches you how to rebuild. Banks won't touch you. Employers discriminate. Landlords reject you. There's no roadmap for recovery. Jennifer's expression shifted to the focused interest she showed when an idea resonated. You're talking about a nonprofit? Educational foundation? Maybe. I don't know exactly. But I have $17 million I didn't earn through my own work. My father earned it 70 years ago and protected it for me. Using it just for personal comfort feels like wasting his gift. He wanted me to build something that mattered. The idea germinated over the following weeks. Claire researching nonprofit structures and financial education programs during lunch breaks and evening hours after Mia was asleep. She discovered gaps in existing services. Plenty of programs taught budgeting to low-income families, but few addressed the specific challenges of rebuilding after bankruptcy, eviction, or catastrophic financial loss. People in crisis didn't need lectures about spending habits. They needed tactical support navigating systems designed to keep them excluded, how to find housing with eviction history, how to rebuild credit after bankruptcy, how to access emergency funds without predatory lenders, how to negotiate with creditors and government agencies. Claire knew those challenges intimately. She'd lived them, survived them, and now had resources to help others navigate the same terrain. By March, she drafted a business plan for what she tentatively called the Second Chance Financial Foundation. Services would include one-on-one financial counseling for people emerging from bankruptcy, emergency grants for families facing eviction, legal aid navigation, credit rebuilding programs, and educational workshops on systemic financial recovery. Sarah Chun reviewed the incorporation documents, ensuring proper nonprofit structure that would protect Claire from liability while maximizing tax advantages. Jennifer helped design the financial model. An initial endowment of $5 million would generate annual operating budget around $200,000, enough to fund a small staff and serve perhaps 300 families per year. You're sure about this? Jennifer asked as they finalized paperwork. $5 million is significant commitment. You could invest it, generate income for yourself. I'm sure. My father protected this money for 70 years, waiting for someone who needed it desperately enough to use it wisely. I can't be that person if I just hoard it for personal wealth accumulation. The foundation launched in May with office space in a converted warehouse in Kensington, deliberately chosen in a working-class neighborhood where the people who needed services could actually reach it. Claire hired 2 staff members, Marcus Williams, a bankruptcy attorney who'd done pro bono work for years and wanted to transition to full-time advocacy, and Diana Chun, a financial counselor who'd lost her own house to foreclosure during the 2008 crisis and understood the stigma and practical challenges involved. The first client walked through the door on a Tuesday morning in late May. A woman named Patricia Rodriguez, 43, recently divorced, facing eviction after her ex-husband stopped paying child support and disappeared. She had 2 children, a job that paid $14 an hour, and $83 in her checking account with rent due in 5 days. Claire recognized her own story in Patricia's details, the specific arithmetic of impossible choices, the exhaustion of trying to explain to people who'd never been desperate why she couldn't just work harder or budget better. "We're going to help you," Claire said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Not with judgment or lectures, but with actual resources and tactical support. "What do you need most urgently?" Patricia's answer was immediate. "Money for rent so my kids don't lose their home. But I can't take charity. I need to earn it somehow. Need to know I'm not just another welfare case." Claire understood that pride, that need to maintain dignity even when accepting help. "How about this? We provide emergency rent grant to prevent eviction. In exchange, you volunteer 10 hours helping other clients once you're stable. Pay forward the help you received to someone else who needs it." The compromise allowed Patricia to accept assistance while maintaining agency. Over the following weeks, Marcus helped her file for formal child support enforcement. Diana worked with her on credit repair and budgeting for the irregular income that came from service industry work. The foundation paid 3 months' rent, enough breathing room for Patricia to catch up and stabilize. By August, Patricia was volunteering as promised, helping other clients navigate social service systems with the expertise of someone who'd been through them. By December, she'd been promoted at work, secured consistent child support payments, and moved to a better apartment that she could afford on her own. One success story. One family pulled back from the edge. Claire knew it didn't solve systemic poverty or economic inequality, but it proved the model worked. Tactical intervention at the crisis point combined with ongoing support could help people rebuild lives that seemed irreparably broken. The foundation served 47 families in its first 6 months, with success rates of around 65%, maintaining housing stability a year later. Not perfect, but substantially better than the near-zero success rate for people who fell through existing safety net programs. Claire's life settled into rhythms that felt sustainable rather than desperate. Mornings with Mia getting ready for school, days at the foundation office helping clients and training staff, evenings with homework and dinner and the comfortable domesticity she'd once taken for granted. The row house became genuinely home rather than temporary shelter, filled with Mia's artwork and Sophie's frequent presence and the accumulated stuff that indicated people actually lived there rather than just surviving between crises. Money existed now as background security rather than foreground anxiety. Claire still checked account balances compulsively, still felt a flutter of panic when unexpected expenses arose, but gradually learned to trust that resources existed to handle problems. The poverty mindset lingered, turning off lights religiously, buying generic brands, keeping emergency cash hidden in drawers, but the sharp edge of fear dulled incrementally. In September, nearly a year after discovering the bonds, Claire received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line made her stomach clench, "From your sister Margaret." She almost deleted it unread, but curiosity won out over caution. Margaret had maintained complete silence since the court losses, no attempts to contact or reconcile. Whatever this message contained, it represented some kind of shift. "Claire, I'm writing because my therapist suggested I should take accountability for how I treated you last year. I'm not expecting forgiveness or reconciliation. Just want to acknowledge that I was wrong. When I heard about the bonds, my immediate reaction was greed disguised as concern. I told myself I deserved equal share, that you were being selfish, that Dad couldn't have meant to exclude Richard and me. But I've spent the past months in therapy working through why I reacted that way, why money made me ugly. The truth is I was jealous. Jealous that Dad trusted you enough to leave you everything. Jealous that you had integrity I'd never developed, that you'd risked your career for ethics, while I'd spent mine rationalizing compromises. Jealous that even broke and desperate, you were someone he believed in. I tried to take your daughter from you. I can't express how ashamed I am of that. Using Mia as leverage was unconscionable. No amount of money justifies what I put you through. Richard hasn't acknowledged any of this. He's convinced himself you manipulated Dad, that the video testimony was somehow coerced. He's still angry, still convinced he was cheated. I don't expect him to change, but I'm different. Or trying to be. I'm working on becoming someone who doesn't measure worth in dollar amounts, who doesn't see family as competition for resources. I don't expect you to respond to this. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I recognize what I did was wrong, and I'm sorry. Margaret. Claire read the email 3 times, searching for manipulation or ulterior motive beneath the apology. But it seemed genuine in its self-awareness, in its acknowledgement of specific harms rather than vague regret. She sat with the message for 2 days before responding, weighing what forgiveness meant and whether it required reconciliation. Her father's letter had warned about trust being earned rather than given freely. Margaret's apology was a start, but words were easy. Change behavior over time would be the actual test. Margaret, I appreciate your apology and the self-examination it represents. What you and Richard did last year was deeply harmful, using Mia as leverage cross lines that can't be easily uncrossed. I'm not ready for a relationship right now. Maybe someday, but not yet. The wounds are too fresh, and I need to protect Mia from people who've proven willing to hurt her to get what they want. But I do forgive you for my own sake rather than yours. Carrying anger and resentment only poisons me. You made choices motivated by greed and jealousy. I'm choosing not to let those choices define the rest of my life. If you're genuinely working on becoming better, I'm glad. That's important work regardless of whether it leads to reconciled family relationships. Claire. She sent the email without expecting response, and none came. Margaret had said what she needed to say. Claire had acknowledged it, and now they could both move forward without the weight of unresolved hostility. Richard never apologized. Through mutual contacts, Claire heard he'd told people she'd stolen his inheritance, that their father had been senile and manipulated, that the whole situation was evidence of Claire's lifelong selfishness. The narrative he'd constructed protected him from confronting his own behavior, and Claire accepted that some people would never acknowledge their role in creating pain. October brought Mia's 11th birthday, celebrated with a party at their house that included 20 classmates, pizza, and a rented bounce house in the backyard. Claire watched her daughter laugh with friends, completely integrated into a social world that had been disrupted so many times over the past year, and felt profound gratitude that they'd survived to reach this moment. That evening, after guests had left and Mia was asleep surrounded by birthday presents, Claire sat with her father's radio, playing softly. She'd kept it despite offers from collectors who recognized its value as pristine example of 1952 engineering. The radio wasn't about collector value. It was about connection to the man who'd built it, who'd hidden salvation inside it, who trusted her to find it when desperation made her humble enough to look. "Thank you, Dad," she said to the empty room, to the radio, to whatever part of her father's consciousness might persist in memory and gratitude. "You saved us, not just with the money, but with the faith that we could handle it responsibly. I hope I'm proving you right." The Foundation's one-year anniversary in May brought media attention Claire hadn't anticipated. A Philadelphia Inquirer reporter did a feature on the Second Chance Financial Foundation, interviewing clients who'd been helped and exploring the model of tactical crisis intervention combined with ongoing support. The article mentioned Claire's own bankruptcy and recovery in broad strokes, positioning her as someone who understood clients' struggles firsthand. It didn't mention the bonds or the $17 million. Claire had been careful to structure the foundation's funding through anonymous donation to protect her privacy. But the publicity brought new challenges. Donors contacted the foundation offering support, requiring Claire to expand operations she'd intended to keep small and personal. By the end of the year, the foundation had served 127 families with a waiting list of 83 more. Claire hired additional staff, moved to larger office space, developed training programs so other cities could replicate the model. What had started as personal mission to honor her father's gift evolved into something larger. Movement to address systemic gaps in how American society handled financial crisis and recovery. 2 years after discovering the bonds, Claire stood before a conference of nonprofit leaders presenting the Second Chance model. The foundation had helped 342 families, with 71% maintaining housing stability and financial progress at the one-year mark. Success rates that exceeded anything in existing literature on poverty intervention. The key isn't treating people in crisis as problems to be solved, Claire explained to the audience of foundation directors and social workers. It's recognizing that they're navigating systems deliberately designed to exclude them and providing tactical support to overcome those barriers. Emergency funds prevent eviction. Legal navigation resolves debt and custody issues. Credit rebuilding opens access to housing and employment. Financial education teaches sustainable practices. You need all 4 components working together. After the presentation, a woman approached, late 50s, well-dressed, carrying herself with the authority of someone used to being taken seriously. "Miss Meadows, I'm Catherine Brennan from the Rockwell Foundation. We're interested in funding expansion of your model to 10 additional cities. Would you be willing to discuss grant partnership?" The Rockwell Foundation had assets exceeding $800 million. Their involvement could transform the Second Chance Foundation from Philadelphia nonprofit to national program. Claire found herself negotiating terms that would have seemed fantastical 2 years earlier. $5 million in initial funding, technical assistance for expansion, national platform to advocate for policy changes. She accepted, understanding that her father's gift was multiplying in ways he couldn't have imagined. $5 million from the bonds had seeded a foundation that would now leverage another $5 million from Rockwell to help thousands of families across the country. Mia, now 12, had developed her own relationship with her grandfather's legacy. She'd started volunteering at the foundation on weekends, helping with administrative work and playing with clients' children while their parents met with counselors. Claire watched her daughter absorb lessons about service and compassion, about using privilege to help rather than hoard. "Mom," Mia asked one Saturday afternoon as they drove home for the foundation office, "when I grow up, can I run the foundation?" The question made Claire's throat tight. "If that's what you want, baby. But you can do anything. You don't have to limit yourself to what I've built." "I know, but I like helping people. And Grandpa left us the money so we could do good things, right? Seems like running the foundation is a good thing." "It is. And if that's what you choose, I'll support you completely. But you've got years to figure out what you want. No pressure to decide now." They drove in comfortable silence, the radio playing contemporary pop rather than her father's big band music. Different generation building on foundations laid by previous ones. That evening, Claire updated her will, documents she drafted after the bonds cleared but hadn't reviewed since. The trust for Mia was already established, but she added provisions about the foundation's future leadership, ensuring it would continue even after she was gone. Most of the remaining $10 million in personal investments would eventually go to the foundation, with enough set aside for Mia's security, but not so much that it eliminated her motivation to build her own life. Claire's father had understood that balance, providing enough to prevent desperation without creating entitlement. 3 years after the bonds cleared, Claire received an unexpected letter from Arthur Pemberton. The elderly attorney was retiring, closing his practice after 52 years, and wanted to tie up final details with Robert Meadows' estate. They met at his office, boxes already packed, files organized for transfer to whoever took over his remaining cases. Pemberton looked friendlier than Claire remembered, the years taking their toll, but his mind remained sharp. "I wanted to give you this personally," he said, handing her a small wooden box. "Your father left it with me along with the bonds documentation. Instructions were to deliver it only after the bonds were redeemed and you'd had time to establish your life." Inside the box was a pocket watch, silver, tarnished with age, engraved with her father's initials and the date 1952. A note accompanied it in her father's handwriting. "Claire, this watch was given to me by the engineers I worked with on Project Longwave when the bonus money came through. They inscribed it with the date I bought the bonds, marking the moment I chose future security over immediate gratification. I wore it every day for 40 years, a reminder that patience and planning matter more than instant reward. I'm giving it to you for the same reason. Remember that the choices you make today create the foundation for tomorrow. You've proven yourself worthy of the trust one placed in you. Build something beautiful with the time you've been given. Love always, Dad." Claire held the watch, feeling its weight, imagining her father wearing it through decades of his life. The engraving had worn smooth in places where his wrist had rubbed against it, physical evidence of time passing and being measured. She had it restored, not to pristine condition, but to working order, preserving the wear that testified to its history. She wore it on special occasions, feeling connected to the man who'd made possible everything she'd built. For years after discovering the bonds, the Second Chance Financial Foundation operated in 15 cities, had helped over 2,400 families, and had become a recognized model for crisis intervention. Claire testified before Congress about financial system reforms, wrote articles for policy journals, spoke at conferences about dignity-centered approaches to poverty. The work was exhausting and fulfilling in equal measure, the kind of meaningful engagement she'd never found in corporate finance. Every family helped was vindication of her father's faith, proof that his 70-year investment in her future had generated returns measured in lives changed rather than dollars earned. Mia excelled in school, participated in debate club and volunteer programs, showed leadership qualities that suggested she'd be formidable in whatever field she eventually chose. She understood their family history, the bonds, the betrayal by relatives, the choice to build something helpful rather than merely comfortable. Do you ever regret not keeping more money for yourself? Mia asked one evening as they prepared dinner together. The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Claire considered it honestly. Sometimes I think about what else we could have: bigger house, fancy vacations, expensive things. But then I remember what it felt like to have $67 and no options. The foundation helps people feel less alone in that moment. That's worth more than anything money could buy for just us. Even when Aunt Margaret and Uncle Richard were so mean. Especially then, they thought money was about what it could buy them personally. Dad wanted me to understand it's about what you can build for others. The foundation proves he was right. 5 years after the bonds cleared, Claire stood in the office that had become her second home, looking at photos on the wall, clients who'd graduated from the program, families who'd rebuilt lives that seemed irreparable, children who'd avoided homelessness because tactical intervention had prevented their parents' eviction. Patricia Rodriguez was there in one photo, smiling with her children in front of the house she'd eventually managed to buy. Marcus Williams had helped her navigate credit repair. Diana Chun had worked with her on saving strategies, and the foundation's emergency grant had prevented the eviction that would have derailed everything. Dozens of similar stories surrounded Claire in photographic testimony, proof that her father's gift had multiplied beyond its monetary value into something that couldn't be quantified in dollars. Her phone rang. Jennifer's name on the caller ID. Claire, turn on the news. Channel 6. The television in the conference room showed a breaking story. Whitmore Financial Group executives indicted on federal fraud charges related to the Henderson Real Estate Fund. The scheme Claire had refused to participate in, the ethical stance that had cost her career, was finally being prosecuted. The reporter detailed falsified compliance reports, misrepresented asset values, investor losses exceeding $200 million. Claire watched former colleagues being led from the building in handcuffs, the same people who'd called her unstable and difficult when she tried to prevent exactly this outcome. Federal prosecutors credit an anonymous whistleblower whose complaint in 2023 triggered the investigation. The reporter continued. That individual, whose identity remains protected, provided documentation that became foundation for today's indictments. Jennifer's voice came through the phone. That was you. You were the whistleblower who started all this. Claire had known the SEC investigation was proceeding. She'd given testimony, provided documents, answered questions over many months. But seeing actual consequences, watching the people who destroyed her career face justice, felt surreal. Does this vindicate you? Jennifer asked. I don't know. It proves I was right, but it doesn't give me back the year I lost, the terror Mia experienced, the struggle we went through. Claire paused, reconsidering. Actually, maybe I'm grateful for that struggle. Without it, I wouldn't have been desperate enough to find the bonds. Wouldn't have understood what clients at the foundation are experiencing. Wouldn't have built something that matters. Your father would be proud. I hope so. I really hope so. That evening, Claire and Mia sat with her father's radio playing softly, big band music filling the house with sound from another era. The watch sat on the coffee table between them, marking time with mechanical precision that had survived 70 years. Tell me again about Grandpa Robert, Mia requested, cuddling against her mother's side. Claire told the stories she'd assembled from memory and imagination. Her father as a young engineer, buying bonds instead of spending his bonus, building a radio to hide his secret, maintaining faith across decades that someone would eventually need what he'd protected. A man who'd understood that patience and planning mattered more than instant gratification, who'd chosen his daughter's future over his other children's greed. Do you think he knew? Mia asked. That you'd find the bonds exactly when you needed them most? I think he hoped. He couldn't have predicted exactly when or how, but he trusted that desperation would make me humble enough to look beyond surface value. He was right. They sat in comfortable silence, the radio playing on, and Claire felt the weight of gratitude that had become familiar companion. Her father had given her more than money. He'd given her proof that planning for others' welfare mattered, that integrity had value beyond immediate reward, that patience could transform hidden treasure into legacy worth more than its dollar amount. The bonds had been real. The money had been real. But the actual inheritance was the faith that someone believed she could handle both responsibility and wealth without losing herself in the process. She'd proven him right. The foundation helped families rebuild. The investment accounts generated sustainable income. Mia was thriving, and Claire had built a life that honored the gift rather than squandering it. Some legacies were measured in millions of dollars. Others were measured in lives changed, families stabilized, hope restored to people who'd lost everything. Claire's father had given her both, and she'd transformed them into something he would have recognized as worthy of his 70-year investment. The radio played on into the evening, filling the house with music from an era when a young engineer had made choices that would echo across generations, and Claire sat with her daughter, thinking about the future they'd build on the foundation he'd laid. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything that mattered. The end. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.